And the Provost's office, Mocs Go Vote, is a committee of faculty, staff, and students, particularly from SGA, who are just interested in promoting civic engagement, getting our campus interested in all things election, and then in non-election years, all things kind of policy advocacy, and just kind of sharing the spirit of civic participation. And so we want to thank you all for being here. If you hadn't noticed on the way, there are free t-shirts outside, and see, Autumn's got pizza as well. So today, my colleague, Dr. Chris Acuff, and I are going to be talking about voting and election administration. And we want to invite you near the end to ask questions that you might have about the process if you didn't receive the information you needed, or if you have questions or concerns about how you actually go about the process of voting. And I also want to invite you to another event next Wednesday as part of our series where my other colleague, Dr. Sarah Heiss, and I will be talking about polling, forecasting, and sort of thinking about 2 weeks out, what's the state of the race as it is. And so there'll be information about that, both in the newsletter and sent out from the Provost's office. And with that, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Appreciate you being here. And so I'll turn it off to my colleague, Dr. Chris Acuff.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so Dr. Strickland mentioned, they did an event last week, they're talking about civility and things like that. We figured this one would be more of just like a bare bones, like what to expect, where to go, what's on the ballot, and kind of like how the process works. So if you've never voted before, or maybe it's been a while, hopefully some of this is a refresher, but we'll kind of cover some of the basics, and then again, if you have questions at the end, we're happy to address them. Okay, so what's on the ballot? My colleagues tell me that there's something big at the top, although I'm a state and local government guy. So they tell me that there's some other big election people are focused on this year. So obviously presidential politics dominates pretty much the entire, media and like social ecosphere in an election year. So I don't think I need to tell you about that one. What I did want to mention though, is depending on where you live, or in Tennessee, Georgia, there are other things that you might see on the ballot. So in any given year, there are probably some local elections going on. There's probably maybe some state election going on, again, depending on where you live. In Tennessee and Georgia, any given year, or at least every other year, we are always electing at least House members, potentially a Senate member or two, depending on where you are, if you were in Georgia 2 years ago. But in Tennessee and Georgia, they're like all U.S. House members. In Tennessee, we have a U.S. Senate election. So Marsha Blackburn, Gloria Johnson, and a few other candidates, I believe, have qualified for that race. In the state level, all of the Tennessee State General Assembly members in the House and half of the Senate will be elected this year. So if you are in a House district in Tennessee, if you're in a Senate district in Tennessee, that's an even number, it's like District 10 here in Hamilton County, you will have a you will have a state Senate election coming up. All of the House positions in the General Assembly also will be up. If you're in Georgia, everybody in the General Assembly basically is elected every 2 years. Depending on where you live, again, locally, we may have some other races. So if you're in Hamilton County, I've listed some of the other cities on the ballot. Some of these are, basically uncontested. Some are fairly contentious elections. In Lakeside, for instance, basically they have 3 seats up. There's 3 people running. It's an easy pick. In Collegedale and Red Bank and a few other cities, there's a lot more people running for a fewer number of positions. So the city elections, again, matter. Come talk to me after if you care about local elections. Same thing in Georgia. There's school board races. There's several county positions, judicial elections, all that stuff. So don't be surprised if you go into the ballot box and you don't just see Trump-Harris on the ballot, right? So think about all the other races that are on the ballots too. Okay, if you've never voted before, anybody, this is your first election? Don't be shy. Several of you. Okay. There's always this message of like, make a plan. Okay, so figure out where you're supposed to vote, when you can go vote, all of those types of things. So number one is usually check your registration. So if you're in Tennessee, I always point people just go to the Secretary of State's website. They have an app. It's great. you can look up your current voter registration. Some of you may have registered, potentially like your senior of high school. You may be registered back home. Some of you may have registered or re-registered here in Hamilton County. Make sure you know where you're registered because that will matter. Thinking about where and when and how to vote. So several different options. So one, you can vote early. So in Georgia and Tennessee, early voting is happening now. So you can go vote early anywhere within these two states. Lots of other states have already started this process. You can vote absentee with caveats. I'll talk about that later. Or you can vote on election day. So obviously there are some differences in how these things work and what you need to prepare for these. So I'll kind of talk about these briefly. So early voting, like I mentioned, happening now. In Tennessee, you've got until Halloween. In Georgia, you have one extra day till November 1st, basically. So if you want to go vote early, you can go to those polling locations. Again, those will be listed on your local county election commission's website. In Hamilton County, I think we have 4 or 5 now. The easiest one close to us is the election commission right down in Nicola. But depending on where you live, there may be a location that's closer to you. So if you vote early, you don't go to your actual assigned precinct. You go to one of these central voting locations. If you're voting absentee, here are some caveats. So in Tennessee, one, we're not what we call a no excuse state. So in a lot of states, they have no excuse absentee voting. Basically, anybody that wants to vote absentee can. In Tennessee, you have to have a reason for voting absentee, and I won't list all the reasons. There's several. If you're an elderly person, if you're hospitalized, if you're a caretaker for a parent or grandparent or something like that, you can check a box. But one of the reasons you can vote absentee is you're a college student who's away at college. So if you're registered to vote in Tennessee and you go to if you go to state school or any school in Tennessee, you can check that box and say, hey, I'm a student away at college. I want to vote in my home county. So you fill out a form, mail it to them or email it to them. They'll send you a ballot. The challenge of that is if you have registered online and never voted in an election before, you can't request an absentee ballot. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so dramatic pause. So in Tennessee and a lot of other states, you have to show proof of identity, right? So in Tennessee, this is one of the states where you have to present yourself basically the first time to vote in person so they know that you are who you say you are. So if you just registered, maybe you just graduated from high school, you registered back home, you're planning on voting absentee, and you've never voted before, and you didn't register in person, you can't vote by absentee ballot in Tennessee. They'll send you a very nice letter saying, thanks, but no thanks, try next time. So your options are either go home and vote during early voting, or go home on election day, basically. I will say, and again, I'm put caveats by this, there are some counties that will basically verify your ID for you, but I always say check with the local election commission to make sure that's still a thing. Several were doing it during COVID. Basically, you could go to the local election commission here, let's say you're from Shelby County, and they would say, hey, Shelby County, Joe or Jane Smith came, they showed me their ID, it's them, I checked, they're good. But again, check with the local election officials to make sure you can still do that. If you are voting absentee, ballot request deadlines are up here. In Georgia, there is a no excuse state, and you can actually just basically mail them a copy of your driver's license. So they're a little bit more lax on the IDs and things like that you need. In both states, ballots must be received by the close of election day or the close of polls on election day. So depending on the state, they have different rules governing when the ballot must be received. Some states, as long as it's postmarked, some states it has to be received by a certain time. Some states give you extra couple days after the election. So in Tennessee and Georgia, though, it has to be received by the close of polls on election day. So make sure if you're going to vote absentee, you get it in. Election day. Okay, so one, again, check your voting precinct, know where you're registered. So you must vote in your voting precinct on election day. We've had students here in the past who've shown up on election day and like, hey, I'm ready to go vote. Awesome. Where are you registered? Oh, back home in Nashville. Okay, well, you should get going then because it's a long drive, or Shelby County or wherever, right? So make sure you know where you're registered on election or to vote if you're going to vote on election day. In Tennessee and Georgia, remember, bring a required ID. Again, there's a list of these on Secretary of State's website, Election Commission websites, et cetera. I always note, too, UTC ID is not a valid form of ID in Tennessee. driver's license, passport, other things qualify, but a UTC ID is not an acceptable form of ID to vote here. In Georgia, if you go to a state school and you have a state issued ID or a state school issued ID, that is actually a form. So Tennessee, you can't do it, Georgia, you can. When you're voting, depending on which county you're in, they may have different kind of modes of ballots there. So depending on what county you're in, you may have a paper ballot. You may go up and use a machine or some combination of the two, basically. So if you're from Davidson County, you may be used to using the little machine. If you're in Hamilton County, you're going to fill out an optical scan ballot. If any of you took standardized tests as kids, filled in little bubbles, basically that's what you do. So then you'll feed it into a machine if you vote here in Hamilton County. So again, kind of knowing the equipment is also important. Usually this is listed on a election commission website. They'll kind of tell you what to expect. The other thing is too, you can always ask for help. So obviously, poll officials are trained, they help people all the time, so don't feel embarrassed if you don't know what's happening, if you're not 100% sure. Like, don't just go in and just kind of like toss your ballot and just kind of run out. Like, if you're not sure that you filled it out correctly or that you know what's going on, ask somebody, I promise they'll help. Okay, so the other thing I tell people too is if you forget your ID, if something happens, if there's, you're unsure about the process, whatever, you can always request what they call a provisional ballot. So if they're like, oh, we just can't find you in the system, or oh, you forgot to bring your ID, whatever, ask for a provisional ballot. Again, caveats is it won't necessarily count then, but if you can provide certain forms of ID or show that you were registered already and they, for some reason, couldn't find you in the system or whatever, you can always go back and then they will count your ballot. So if there's ever a question about you not having ID, you not being registered, or some other thing that happens, ask for a provisional ballot. They'll give you one, they'll kind of keep it separate, but then you can go back to the election commission and show them whatever form of ID or proof of registration, et cetera, that you need to for them to count your ballot. So if there's a problem, they'll help you, but if it comes down to it, ask for a provisional ballot. Okay, some basics about election administration, just kind of quickly. So generally, other than federal elections and the dates, most of the election administration and kind of like when elections happen, the time, place, and manner, as we call it, of elections happens at the state level. So the federal government basically says, hey, we're going to elect presidents and Congress and Senate members first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Everything else is up to you guys. Great. Most of us have just decided to align with that election schedule. But from the administration standpoint, here's what happens. Is usually it's a fairly decentralized process. So states set election dates, how things work, how ballots work, et cetera, but at the county level is usually kind of where the rubber meets the road. And so that decentralization, sometimes is both a good and a bad thing, I would argue. So one, it helps ensure that there's a lot more people involved in the process, right? There's no like one actor or person who can, add a few extra ballots here or, over here if you want to, right? There's a lot more people involved in the process. It's a lot harder to, for somebody to make a mistake or there not to be a check and balance on kind of how the system works. So decentralization of these things is good. Again, the caveat to that is that sometimes it makes it a little more confusing. And so, like when I was looking up stuff, admittedly, I was born and raised in Tennessee, go Balls, and I only dabble in Georgia. So looking at Georgia's election administration system, they're a lot less uniform in how they administer their elections. It really just depends by the county, and there's 159 counties. So everyone is just a little bit different. So again, it can make it a little bit confusing. I won't get down in the weeds, but just to let you know how this stuff works. Every state has a chief election administration official. So usually this is the Secretary of State. Here in Tennessee, Secretary of State is chosen by the legislature. In Georgia, it's an elected position. So again, even how we select these people that are over elections varies. At the state level in Tennessee, there's an election commission basically that's appointed by the legislature, and then they appoint members of the county election commissions. And so the way it works here is that at the state level, the majority party in the legislature gets 4 seats, the minority party gets 3. At the county level, that's 3 seats and 2 seats respectively. So again, there's a little bit of partisanship involved in the process, but there's members of both parties. Again, we're a 2-party system. There's members of both parties who oversee elections and the process and things of that nature. Georgia just changed theirs, and Dr. Strickle may kind of touch on Georgia a little bit, but they just changed their system where there's a new appointment method for these people. Once the ballots are cast and everything, we get to the point where local election officials will process, count, and certify totals. So there's certain dates set by state law and when these totals have to be counted, when the ballots have to be sent up to Nashville or Atlanta, respectively. In Tennessee, it's the third Monday after the election. Georgia is the next Monday following the election. And then state officials will certify these things. If you caught the news yesterday, there was just a court case in Georgia about how this process works. Basically, the word "shall" is a very important word. If you're a public law person or a legal scholar of some sort, the word "shall" is apparently very important. So there's a question over whether county election officials, had some discretion in the process. Over certifying elections, over whether they could kind of conduct their own investigations. And these things will probably still play out over the next couple of weeks and months, honestly, and Dr. Strick will touch on that. But I wanted to mention that. Okay, what to expect on election night. Do not expect the presidential race to be called. I don't know why we've gotten to that point, but we have, where we just want instant gratification. It's like, I push the button, I want to know who won now. If you remember 2020, this took a while. I've got a map in a second that shows you how this played out. But don't expect a winner on election night. Same thing for control of the House and Senate at the U.S. level, at the federal level. We're probably not going to be sure for at least a day or three, maybe even longer. So don't expect a call on election night. Many states will be called after polls close, and people always kind of question this. 10 minutes after the polls close in, Oklahoma, well, how do they know that Donald Trump was going to win? Okay, it's complicated. But, generally they look at polls, exit polls, there's a whole process. Experts in these states make these calls. And again, the AP or one of the media outlets calling a race doesn't make it official. Election officials make these things official. So just because CBS, NBC, somebody calls a race, that doesn't mean that's actually who won yet. So just caveats there. So again, it may take several days, maybe a week or two, et cetera. Okay, here's how the timeline played out as a refresher. Some of you are shuddering, sorry. Most states were called by midnight Eastern time on election night. So again, all the states are kind of the lightest color, and sorry if that's not great contrast, but all the states that are kind of the lighter colors, including Tennessee and others in here, those are called election night. We basically knew who was going to win. There weren't that many close races, et cetera. So that's a whole other conversation. But those were called on election night. The next day, 11 additional states. So the vast majority of states had called it basically by, I think, 5 o'clock the next afternoon. I think Michigan and a few others were called by, let's say, 5 or 6 o'clock the next day. But that didn't get somebody to 270 electoral college votes. And so we were waiting on Pennsylvania and other states. So it wasn't until 4 days later that Pennsylvania and a few other states actually sent in their final returns. And again, if you're in Georgia were several weeks later. So again, there was 2 contested Senate races. There was obviously a very, very close presidential race that we were waiting on hearing back. So again, don't expect anything election night. Don't expect anything maybe even the next day. If there's a lot of close states, it may be a little bit.
Thank you. I want to touch a little bit more on some of the things that Dr. Acuff was discussing about how the election works, particularly at the presidential level, how that works on election night and into the following days, maybe even the following week or so, and how that occurred in 2020, and what kind of patterns might we expect for 2024. But first, I just want us to think a little bit about, from an abstract position, kind of what the role of an election is. So I'm a scholar of American political development, and so through that I look at the historical development and construction of the American political regime. And so we think about democratization as a historical process that's played out over time, and it's not an end state that we are getting to. It's not like we eventually become a democracy. Democracies can become, or a regime can become more democratic, less democratic over time. And so scholars are increasingly writing with urgency about democratic backsliding in the United States. Well, so for a democracy, an election is supposed to do one of 2 things. The first thing it does is it's supposed to present a choice. So elections are working well when you have campaigns that are contested and grand visions and policy agendas are being put forth, and so that the voters know that they have a choice between between two, maybe more, but given the nature of our system, two political parties, two presidential candidates. So it creates choice, but that often leads to polarization because you are necessarily contrasting yourself against someone else. The second thing elections do are they bestow legitimacy on the regime itself, so that when we are provided a choice and we make that choice, we have at least gone through the process of having the peaceful transfer of power, legitimizing governing authority in whichever new political party comes to power or party that might remain in power. And so we tend to think about these elections as kind of heightened moments of citizenship where the people have spoken. But what if not everyone has the right to vote or has easy access? And so it opens up these questions about the legitimacy of election and whether or not the people have actually spoken. And so this is where election administration, where the rubber meets the road, particularly at the county level, where the trust that we have in those that are administering the elections, 51 across the states and the District of Columbia, thousands across all of the counties. So on election day, you have hundreds, if not thousands of elections that are happening that are all supposed to be legitimizing the transfer of power and legitimizing, authorizing the people's vote. And so scholars think about states as the infrastructure of democracy. If we are a democratic regime, a small d democratic regime, it's really the states that are the ones that put the elections into process. Now, we also know then that there's unevenness across the states. If states are where democracy happens, we also know that some states can be less democratic than others. And so scholars of subnational democracy write about the ways in which voting ID laws, whether or not you have early registration, what it means to be able to mail in a ballot, absentee ballot rules, all of these things are left up to the states. And so we can say that one's level of democracy could vary based on the state in which you live. And so we just want to focus on election administration as the actual task of administering and running an election. And so we can then think about what this means for some of the recent events that we've encountered, particularly the hurricanes Helene and to some extent Milton. Now, as you see up here, the western part of North Carolina was particularly hardest hit. And these are areas that currently do not have, well, some of them do not have access to electricity, the polling places. Some of them do not have literal locations where their ballots can be mailed. They do not have administrators in some places that are able to fully devote their time to election administration because they have lost loved ones. So we are asking a lot of those who are really doing the work of administering elections during a time of deep polarization where concerns about false, fraudulent voting, misinformation about the federal government coming in and taking over certain areas of these populations, where you have real voters, citizens, who are potentially being denied the access to the ballot for contingent reasons, a natural disaster. And so the secretaries of state of both Georgia and North Carolina, and again, to some extent, Florida, are working diligently to make sure that these people have the right to vote, have that ballot. And so when we think about what it looks like on election night, if we truly want to have a fully democratic process, we have to ensure that everyone's vote counts, gets counted, everyone has access, everyone has the right to vote. And so it may be days, weeks, particularly if we're thinking about North Carolina, and given where the electoral map comes into play, North Carolina really could be the state that swings the election, and Georgia for that matter too. And so we're going to want easy answers and quick answers on election night, but it very likely is the case that 10, 20, 30, 40,000 votes here and there could swing the election. And while you'll notice here, it just happens to be color red, that's the FEMA disaster declaration zone. Those areas are actually primarily Trump Republican counties. And the same with Georgia too. Those areas that were hardest hit tend to be ones that Trump overperformed in. And so again, for someone who supports democracy, even if you are a capital D Democrat, you should support all efforts to make sure that people are getting their election administration needs met so that everyone has a chance to participate in this crucial election. And I'll just say one more final thing. We don't appreciate enough what election administrators go through, and unfortunately, many of them right now are facing death threats and threats of violence because they are the ones that are on the ground with these ballots. And there is real concern, including there's a research project out of the University of Chicago that studies political violence, and they have documented some of these threats that election administrators have received for just doing their job, for doing the real work of running our democracy. And so when you vote, because I know everyone's going to go vote, give a smile and a nod and a thanks to to those who are either volunteering or staffing the election administration center where you're going to be headed. And so then thinking about election administration leads us to reckon with what happened in 2020 and what might happen in 2024. Now, Dr. Acuff alluded to this, but one of the important realities of voting in the United States and the way that we do election administration is that we will not necessarily know on election night who won. And so scholars and pundits have referred to this sort of as the red mirage versus the blue shift. The red mirage is that historically Republicans tend to vote in person. And so if they've early voted or if they are voting on election day, as those results are coming in, if you just look at a map and you're seeing the results come in, it looks like, oh, Arizona's doing really well for Republicans. But historically, Democrats tend to vote through the mail-in process, not overwhelmingly, but certainly they've embraced it more than Republicans have, particularly through COVID-19. And so what ends up happening through the election administration is as we count ballots after the fact that are received by the proper return date, the numbers will shift in a state. So what looks like a overwhelming Republican victory could get chipped away at as more and more Democratic mail-in ballots are counted. And we political scientists, those who follow elections, we knew that this very issue was going to happen in 2020, ahead of time. But it was used as a way for some to delegitimize the election and to say, you have to stop counting the votes on election day, kind of going against what we know to be proper adherence to election administration guidelines. And so the Stop the Steal movement in 2020 both capitalized, this is the deep irony of it, is the argument that there was massive voter fraud coordinated across the country just doesn't fit with the actual decentralized nature of election administration. You would need to have a coordination across all thousands of those different counties, those election administrators, and those who are working at the polls. So the same system that makes it hard to actually do a large-scale electoral manipulation actually came under attack as being something that was completely controlled by the federal government in some way. And so that led to all of these different ways to target the vulnerabilities of a decentralized system, whether that be counting those mail-in ballots, going to election centers where they're being counted and trying to disrupt the counting of those ballots, whether that means filing lawsuits to reject certain ballots, whether that be from some Americans who live overseas or those who I mean, in this particular instance, for our current election, it would not be out of the realm of possibility that some people will try to file lawsuits against some of these mail-in ballots from residents who were affected by the hurricane, right? If you're having these ballots that are coming in and someone's saying, well, they didn't actually get sent to their house. So there is the possibility for targeting those vulnerabilities like we saw in 2020. Of course, we have seen that some states have recounts. If a threshold is not met in the first counting of ballots, it triggers an automatic recount. And so what we saw in the past is certain actors trying to disrupt the counting of those recounts, going to the centers where they were happening. And of course, there's the certification of the actual election itself, which is required by the Constitution for states to certify it. And of course, that eventually led to the January 6th insurrection and trying to disrupt the counting of those certifications. And so what has changed since and what has not changed? Well, a lot of those vulnerabilities have tried to be addressed. But again, because it's decentralized, certain states have taken certain efforts to shore up their election administration, where other states have actually made it a little bit more likely that you're going to have certain challenges. Lawsuits are ongoing. There's already been 160 pre-election lawsuits filed by those inspired or supported by the Republican Party. And so we see that they're already looking at ways to kind of create this narrative of fraudulent votes. Importantly, though, on the other hand, Congress has passed the Electoral Count Act, which updated the ways in which the election will get certified. And so the very short story is it requires far more members of Congress to challenge a state's certification of their election. I think it's like 20% of Congress would have to sign on. So you can't just have one member of Congress, like last time, say, I want to challenge the certification of this election. They've also made it more challenging for how states can create an alternative slate of electors. So that is one thing that Congress did do to shore up the process. And then the other final point here is that because election administration requires legitimacy, it's important to note that the Biden administration will be the administration that is securing the election and the certification of the results. So a lot of the Stop the Steal movement about whether or not Pence could overturn or decertify the election will not be there because you will have Vice President Harris presiding over the Senate. That raises other questions about her running for, I mean, it doesn't challenge the question that she's running for president, but it does raise issues about the attempts by some probably to try to delegitimize her ability to even do that, even though she is a constitutional officer as the president of the Senate. And so I just want everyone to think about what election administration means as a process, what it means for us to engage in electoral politics that requires doing the hard work of running elections and appreciating those that sacrifice and volunteer their time to actually help American democracy function properly. And that these are a lot of the unsung heroes, especially for us political nerds. Like we love our election administrators, and so I hope that you'll appreciate what it means to cast your vote and what people have to go through to make sure that our democracy functions the way it does. And so with that, I think we want to open it up for any questions you might have, comments, concerns, how-to questions. Dr. Acuff will bring a mic down.
My question is for you, Dr. Strickler, because you brought up the hurricane. What's going to happen with the people who may not have their ID to vote? Like if they find them somewhere to go vote, or they get them a ballot, but they might not have their state ID.
That's a great question. So what will happen to those who sadly lost their home, right? So they don't have their ID. Well, I don't know the detailed specifics, but I do know that both North Carolina and Georgia have put out statements on their Secretary of State's websites detailing what you can do. So, for instance, you can go get a state-sanctioned ID at the DMV, but also in terms of mail-in ballots or absentee ballots, they are allowing you to change the residence that you want one sent to, and also kind of changing if you're temporarily sheltering somewhere else, you can make that your current residence for the process of the 2024 election. That's not to say it's not a challenge, and that just means a lot more people might have to go the extra mile to make sure they have that documentation, but it is something that North Carolina, Georgia, and even Florida are aware of, and they are working, I would say, in good faith to make sure that those voters do have access.
I'll play the Jeopardy music.
Everyone's 100% sure about how they're gonna approach this? Oh, there we go.
So all the polls are open. Tennessee, basically, depends on which time zone you're in. In Eastern time, where it's 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., right? So this is also one thing that came up, actually, we were having a discussion earlier this morning, about where to get election information from. And this is why I say I always point people to like their local election commission or the Secretary of State's office. Several, and there's all kinds of groups that do this in good faith, and they do their best. But there's there's a few websites I've seen that have polling information about, let's say, Tennessee, but it's Nashville centric. And so it'll say polls are open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. In Central Time, they are. In Eastern Time, it's 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So so basically what they're doing is they're having polls open and closed at the same time, effectively across the state. They're just accounting for the time zone shift. Yeah. So again, depending on where you get information from, that's why I always just say, like, just go to the official state website or the county website. The other question that came up too, as we were talking this morning, as someone who studies particularly local governments, not all counties or county election commissions or whatever have fantastic websites. And that's nothing against them. They're limited in resources, whatever. And so a lot of these sites, they may be outdated. They may have the old election stuff on there, whatever. So usually I tell people I try to go to the state if the county election commission website or the county website itself is a little iffy. Yeah, good question. If you are, I'll just plug some random information while you're thinking of other questions. If you are on campus, if you are a registered voter on campus, if you're registered in your dorm, the voting precinct is right down here on Martin Luther King Boulevard at Mount Olivet Baptist Church. I believe the plan is to have some vans running during the day to take people to the polls if you want to. There's also probably going to be vans running taking people to the Election Commission on, I believe, Wednesdays. Look for more information on that from SGA. But they're going to be taking people to the polls during early voting over to the Election Commission the next couple weeks. So if you haven't yet made a plan or figured out where you're going to vote and you're registered here in Hamilton County, you can go vote here at the Election Commission or one of the other kind of satellite locations. But otherwise, you'll have to wait and either go back home if you want to vote in person back in your home county, or again, if you fall under the provisions for the absentee ballot and you have voted in person before or otherwise have shown your ID before, you can request an absentee ballot.
So the question was about the misinformation that's on the ground in parts of Western North Carolina, particularly about FEMA, whether or not that opens the space for contesting the legitimacy of the election. Unfortunately, I think that's a possibility. I don't think it will be as, let me put it this way. It'll be different if, let's say North Carolina is the deciding factor, right? Let's say it's extremely close. I don't know the math in my head, but say that the electoral college goes in a way where North Carolina really does decide the vote for Harris. Could I imagine there being a space for misinformation about how that happened? Only if there was a dramatic shift in Democratic turnout in that part of the state, because as I mentioned, I think Western North Carolina, so 1/5 of voters in North Carolina live in a current FEMA designated disaster zone in Western North Carolina. And I believe of those counties, it's like plus 16% Trump from 2020. So it would have to be a dramatic reversal in support for Harris, because if she wins, but all those votes are centrally located in Raleigh and Charlotte and in the urban areas, that won't stop bad faith actors from using misinformation, but I don't think that Western North Carolina itself will be the deciding space. But having said all that, I strongly adhere to the belief that everyone there should have the access to the ballot. So even if that means making sure that we don't know the results of North Carolina for a couple of weeks, it's more important that we have that legitimacy. You have transparency. The best way to counter misinformation is with transparency, and make it clear that we're trying to track down people who requested a mail-in ballot before the hurricane, but we don't know if they were able to get it. But I just don't think in terms of the vote margin that there will be enough where that will really shift the election. But again, I don't doubt that there will be some misinformation about it. We're already seeing talk about it on the ground in some places.
I was going to add one brief thing too. I just happened to see it was a new paper that came out, I think this week. It shows that the longer the election process plays out, the less trust people tend to have in the process. And I think intuitively we all know that. I think there's been other studies too. But I think just using the mechanisms of kind of like gumming up the system, like creates legitimacy concerns, right? And so even if there's a lawsuit that's frivolous, that may not go anywhere or whatever, right? I mean, everybody has a right to be heard, and issues adjudicated, whatever, through the judicial process. And so even if this lawsuit's going to get tossed, or like a judge or somebody else will eventually rule, in a particular way, I think, again, just filing all these lawsuits, just gumming up, the process hurts, again, the small d democratic values that most Americans have. And so the longer this plays out, the less and less people trust, I think, in the outcome. So again, I think that's one of the big challenges. And so again, there were already tons of lawsuits happening this year, and then you add disaster response and other stuff to it. And so again, I think hopefully it doesn't play out like a lot of us anticipate, but I think if we anticipate it and we educate people on the process and how these things work and how long it may take, again, giving sense to that we want transparency and legitimacy, and even if there's a recount, that we want to make sure all ballots are counted properly, that I think that also, kind of helps in the long run. But again, just filing lawsuits that are frivolous or not, whatever, I think also just kind of undermines things too. So that's a big challenge.
So we can all do our part to explain to our friends and family that we probably are not going to know on election night, and that is okay. That is the way things are supposed to be.
So questions about early voting. No, you don't have to request it. You can just show up. Yeah, so basically what they'll do is, let's say you show up for early voting, and I don't know, you forget, and you want to go vote again on election day. Just kidding. I mean, they'll have you in the system, so all these systems are centralized, and they know if you've already early voted or if you've requested an absentee ballot. So this does happen sometimes. Maybe someone requests an absentee ballot anticipating that, oh, I'm just gonna vote absentee this election, and then you're like, you know what? No, I'm just gonna run over here and early vote. They'll see that you've pulled an absentee ballot, and they'll basically cancel that ballot. And so if it does eventually get sent in or whatever, they'll basically mark that as void. So all these systems are centralized where they basically know kind of where and when you vote. Yeah, so that's another kind of like protection they have in the process. I think one of the big things, I didn't mention it, but again, if you've been registered or happen to have voted before, this is a whole nother aspect of election administration, but we went through the redistricting process back in 2022. That includes changing precincts. So if maybe you didn't vote, since 2020, you skipped 2022, you may be voting in a different precinct than you voted back in 2020. So I think that's another important thing to remember. Again, check where you're registered and make sure you know where to go. I've served as a poll watcher before. You can do this if you want to. You can serve as both a poll worker and a poll watcher. So you can be the one who actually helps people vote and give them ballots and check their IDs and all this stuff. You can also serve as kind of like this independent poll watcher. So a lot of nonprofit groups and several of the parties sponsor people to be a poll watcher, and you basically go in and just observe and make sure that stuff is happening the way it's supposed to be happening, and so I've served as a poll watcher before just because I'm a nerd, and just watching the process, usually, not often, but usually the biggest thing that happens is that someone won't realize that they're in the wrong precinct. And so you'll get somebody, like, I've been voting in this precinct for 37 years. And it's like, well, not today, but they'll direct you to the new precinct. And so again, at least in Tennessee and most other places I know of, they have these centralized voter lists. They can pull it up on the computer. They can say, oh, Mr. and Miss So-and-so, actually, you're supposed to be over at that other place, And again, you could arrange for a ride, have somebody pick you up, drive over if you got there, walk, whatever. So again, usually they can help you out. And again, that's why I always tell people, if you have questions, ask. They're there to help you. It's not supposed to be scary. But I think part of what we talk about a lot, and we talked about this the last couple of elections, is even for like super nerd election political scientist people, like sometimes we show up and it's like, whoa, like what's happening here? So we've heard stories of some of our colleagues, like again, they didn't know the correct precinct to show up to. It had changed locations. We've shown up before, or I've shown up before, and like right at the open of polls, and they were still trying to figure stuff out, and like we weren't sure which line to get in and stuff like that, right? So even for us, and I voted a ton, it's still sometimes challenging and confusing. So again, like demystifying the process, I think is part of, again, the idea of voter education that we all take seriously. It's not because you're stupid or inexperienced or you don't know what you're doing or whatever, right? This happens to all of us, and so again, that's why I always tell people, like, just know where you're supposed to go, know what you're supposed to have, request a provisional ballot, all that type of stuff too. Yeah, so questions about like voter IDs here and signature verification and stuff. So in Tennessee, at least, I won't speak to Georgia or anybody else. I'll stick with what I know. At least in Tennessee, they're checking your ID. They're checking your identity to make sure that you are who you say you are. They're not checking your address. So I've had this come up before. Again, I'm a nerd, and so I've had all these things happen to me. When I first moved to Nashville from Knoxville, I had not yet updated my driver's license, and so one of the poll workers tried challenging me my address. I was like, no, this is just to show who I am. This is not my voter registration, And so I'd already registered. I just hadn't updated my address. Sorry, state of Tennessee, but it was just to show who I am. So the thing to remember, at least in Tennessee, is it can also be an expired ID. So if your driver's license is expired, and this is another thing I didn't know. We were doing this stuff in 2018, and I thought it had to be a valid ID. No, it can be expired. So again, this is stuff that I thought I knew that I didn't. So they're just checking to see who you are, who you say you are. I had up on a slide, but a lot of people ask if they have to bring their voter registration card. You don't. Again, they have your information. If you want to bring it, and again, if there's a question over your registration, you can say, hey, I got this card from you, and it shows I'm supposed to come here. So you can bring it, but it's not required. The other question is about like signatures. So this oftentimes, at least in my experience, has come up with absentee ballots. So actually, this happened to my dad in 2020. So COVID, everything's going on, tons more people than normal are requesting absentee ballots. And they said his signature didn't match. So he signed some form or for his driver's license, years and years ago, your signature changes over time. And so they said his signature didn't match. So they sent him a letter back and said, hey, your signature didn't match. And so, of course, he had to resubmit his request for an absentee ballot. So this is another reason to do it early, because in Tennessee and some other states, they basically pre-process these absentee ballots. And so again, if you wait till the last minute to turn it in and your signature doesn't match or there's something else, you may not know. Or again, you may have to go follow up with the election commission afterwards, et cetera. So the signature match is oftentimes a challenge I've seen that come up. But a lot of times the biggest one is when people are doing absentee ballots, because then there's that lag in time between them seeing that it's a different one or thinking it's a different one, sending you a letter back, you redo it, so that's a whole thing. But yeah, so you're supposed to sign, it's supposed to match when you sign an affidavit attesting to where you live. So if you're in Tennessee, they basically print off a little sheet. It says, yes, this is who I am. I'm verifying it under penalty of perjury. I'm signing that I say that, yes, I'm Chris Acuff. I live at this address, et cetera. And then they'll check your signature and make sure that it matches so that you're not impersonating somebody, basically. Ask us a crazy question. Not too crazy.
So the question is about the immediate days after the election and kind of the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns, whatever that Rumsfeld quote was. Well, I will first say I'll make a pitch. Dr. Acuff and I, and Dr. Heiss as well, will be holding a post-election roundup the day after the election, but it's actually going to be more about laying the ground for here's where we are, making it clear, reinforcing that there's a reason that we don't know who won, or we'll probably will not know who won. And so we'll have more to say on that on the immediate day after the election. But for me, it's probably what concerns me, as I already mentioned, was just is political violence, and whether that be directed towards supporters of one party or the other, or specifically election administrators. So if there is a recount in a certain state, if there are, as there will be, mail-in ballots that are being counted that really could shift the outcome of an election, those will be targets, I'll say that way. But fortunately, state administrators are aware of this, and they have, in the language of security talk, they've turned them from soft to hard targets. So these are secured locations. Maricopa County in Arizona not Maricopa County, another county in Arizona, after 2020 actually diverted a lot of their money at the county level to making a new secure facility where they are counting the ballots. So it's unlikely that, I don't think that it will be a problem, but that is the one thing that does concern me, is the actual disruption of counting. Because if you use paper ballots, which most places don't, but for those that do, lost paper ballots you can't find again, like they're done, right? So the destroying of ballots would be something. So besides political violence, I would say the court system. The wild card is the way that the courts will rule. And I think it's an open question whether or not there's some novel legal strategy that's being concocted that we haven't not yet heard about that will be advanced, particularly in select legal venues that might be more favorable to one party versus the other.
Yeah, I'd say briefly too. I would say, I would say the mail-in ballots are probably, I guess, the weakest points in some of these challenges. So the good thing is, I think almost all, if not all states, they have ballot trackers. So if you request an absentee or mail-in ballot, they usually have some built-in system where you can track it and see kind of where it is, if it's coming to you, if it's been sent back, et cetera. So whether you send it USPS or UPS or FedEx or DHL, whatever, is usually you can track it along the process and see where it is. But again, depending on the state, this is one of those things where there are different requirements. Again, oops, did I forget to sign it? Did I forget to send in a photocopy of my ID? There's all these like checks in the process that again assure election integrity, but every single one of those steps is a potential kind of like weak point in somebody just, forgetting like what they should or should not have done. Again, particularly if you're in a state that's been distressed by hurricane or disaster or something else, again, you want to vote and you want to participate in the process, but like, oh, I don't know where my ID is. Oh, they'll be fine. Whatever. I think for some of us, for most of you, this is ancient history, but a lot of us think back to the 2000 election and people like partially bubbling in things. So again, I think just the process of like the paper ballots, did they fully circle that in? Is it a partial? Did they check it? Like all those types of things. Usually when you can tell a voter's intent is usually it's fine. But again, who knows? The good thing is, again, from an administration standpoint is, again, state laws vary. But usually there's basically an appointed set of people. Again, usually it's bipartisan, et cetera. There's lots of people in the room who basically judge these ballots. And so again, you may have, a Democratic and a Republican representative both looking at some of these ballots where they're not 100% sure, and they'll look at it and say yeah, I accept that, okay, move it into the count pile or whatever. And then it'll go through the process, so there's still some they're not sure about. So again, each state has a little bit different process, but it's much harder, obviously, on the mail-in, the mail-in ballots, versus like if you're just standing there, if you're at a machine, if you're in person on election day, saying, yes, I counted that person, et cetera. The other thing too that, a lot of secretaries of state, et cetera, remind everybody of, all the voting machines, there's been a lot of questions over those the last couple of years. The voting machines, they've gone through all these processes, they've gone through all these checks, to make sure that they count the number that they're supposed to count, and all these verification processes and things like that. There's also a lot of stuff they talk about where these are not on a centralized network. So the good thing is that ideally nobody can hack into these things. So again, there's all these checks that election administrators have put in the process, again, that potentially delay counting for maybe a few hours, day, whatever. But again, that's how this is supposed to play out. These are intentional, kind of lags in the system to make sure that everything's not just feeding into one system right at poll close on election night and boom, we have a winner instantly. You know what I mean? So that's why we talk about these things.
All right, well, great questions. I think we're right up against the 1 o'clock hour. Thank you again. There will be another presentation next week, and as I mentioned, there'll be one post-election wrap-up, and there may even be one a couple weeks after the election, depending on where we are. It is our hope and our intent that we can kind of be a service, a voice explaining the process as the election gets closer and continues, the counting continues in the days or weeks after. So thank you for coming. Grab a t-shirt, grab some pizza, and have a great day. Thank you.